Today on the State of Purple podcast, we dive into the NFL draft and what that might look like for Minnesota Vikings with special guest Thor Nystrom from NBC Sports. It is the State of Purple podcast presented by Pilot Games.
Seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Nick. Stay up. Oh, he got it. 30, 10. Touchdown! Are you kidding me? It's a Minneapolis miracle. Oh, my God. No way.
And welcome to the State of Purple podcast. We're going to start with a little shuffle for our video stream here. Get our special guest right in the middle of the camera. I'm Aj Mansour, Jack Day on the other side, and smack dab right in the middle of us is a special guest for today. His name is Thor Nystrom. He is the senior content creator of college football and NFL draft for NBC Sports, and we're going to talk NFL draft. Thor, welcome to the State of Purple podcast. Thanks for taking some time to join us today.
Appreciate you boys having me.
Yeah, we heard you on earlier today with Paul Charchian, 9 to noon on KFAN. Got some good tidbits there and good information, and it made me more excited for this conversation. So we've got a little bit of a different background here. Obviously, this is a podcast version. We can, be a little more loose. We can do what we want and have some freedom. But we also live stream this, so we do take comments, from the chat. So if you're watching this live stream, please feel free to throw some comments and questions in the chat. We'll sprinkle those in throughout the conversation. Thor, for a little background, quick on us. I am very heavy in the NFL. Jack, while being heavy in players in the NFL, also pays close attention to college football and really dives deep into the draft. And then you're going to sprinkle in a lot of draft expertise, a high level of expertise, a new level of stuff there. So looking forward to a roundabout conversation that kind of encompasses all of that. Before we dive into the nuts and bolts of that and how the NFL draft might impact the Minnesota Vikings, the NFC North, all of those things, real quick, I'm very curious. This is our first time meeting here. Jack kind of was talking to you on social media and got this set up. I'd love to know your background. Tell me a little bit about how you got into this industry. Have you always been a college football fan, always an NFL draft fan? How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, well, I'm a Brainerd kid, so hello, Minnesota. This has been a big day for me, and again, happy to join you. Coming up from Minnesota, I always wanted to cover college football and the NFL draft. So that's what I set about doing. Even when I was in high school, it's like every decision was sort of towards that, and I got to cover the Twins for MLB.com in 2008, and then I worked a couple of years of baseball for NBC coming out of that. And then I got the call to do what I really wanted to do, which is college football and NFL draft. So they switched me to that. And that's what I've been doing for the last 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. And it's a dream.
Nice. One quick follow-up, and then I'll let Jack jump in here too. If you're from Minnesota, how do you get interested in college football? I think that I always use that as my excuse for not really diving into college football. Is it's tough. My generation, my lifetime, the Gophers have had some good teams, but they haven't been college football good, high level. How did you dive into that when you don't necessarily have a state team in Minnesota to root for? Now it's different. It is engaging, and they are good now. They have some interest there. But when we were growing up, I'm guessing you're approximately our age. There weren't good college football teams here. How did you get into that?
There sure wasn't. But I enjoyed watching them. Assad Abdul Khalik, Adam Weber, do the whole thing. Darkins, so I really enjoyed watching those teams. But the thing that probably got the hook real deep into my cheek was the NCAA football franchise on PlayStation. Because when I was like a younger kid, it's like Tecmo Super Bowl came out when I was in kindergarten, stuff like that. And then once it got up to the point where the Madden started to drop, this is, I don't know, 6, 7 years later, that's all I was playing. But then a couple years after that, I discovered the NCAA football game, and just everything I thought was better, the recruiting over the draft, stuff like that. And so then I was playing that game around the clock. And I was already obsessed with the NFL draft. And so it just helped me to understand the players in it better too. Once you could start getting the names of the players into the NCAA football game, because before it was just like quarterback 12 or whatever. So I would definitely say that, is how I got obsessed with those two things. And then, watching the Gophers was an interesting education coming up because, up until, well, certainly Mason, and then Fleck now more so Jerry Kill as well. There wasn't a lot of success, as you were mentioning, during our childhood. So it was a lot of watching those teams sort of get their butts kicked in the Metrodome. But you got to see all the fun teams come in. And you remember there was that one game where they upset Penn State, the LeVar Arrington team. So they did have some moments. But either way, just love watching college football.
I didn't know that you stemmed from a baseball background. So that's interesting to me. Like, how does that – I'll say this first and foremost. I'm a fan of how you come across on Twitter with a lot of your draft takes because you are not fearful of calling out some of the bigger names either. I think the one that comes to my mind most recently, I believe, and you can hold me accountable if I'm wrong on this, I think Shaun Wade was a big name last year that you disagreed. I think it was a Todd McShay thing, if I'm remembering correctly. But do you take into consideration, I'm kind of asking this because of the new Vikings regime, do you stem from more of like an analytical background because of the game of baseball, and do you incorporate that into your draft content?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. Like when I was a kid, when I was way into baseball, it was the minutia of it. It was both the statistical aspect and then also what's more interesting about that sport than the other sports is the fully fledged minor league system. And so you're trying to predict which of these guys, that are, any baseball prospect is a long shot, when you're starting 17, 18 years old, which of these guys can actually be viable in the major leagues in 5 years sort of a thing. And then, so then you're trying to figure out how do we predict that? Is there any sort of stats, stuff like that? And then, of course, like the Moneyball, and even before that, Bill James, I was reading like all his periodicals and stuff like that. And as a sport, I'm more interested in football. And so when it switched over, some of that stuff that I was doing, just on the side with my spreadsheets, because I gotten into like really dorky, like dynasty baseball leagues where they had like literally full minor league systems as well. You could have 60 different minor league guys or whatever. So I was trying to, game the system against some of these guys I was playing with. So I already had my own analytic system for that. And like I said, when I went to football, you bring some of that philosophy over, but with football, it's a lot more intriguing because that aspect of it, a lot of that is unexplored. So you're sort of Lewis and Clark coming up with your own stuff. Whereas most people that do baseball now and come at the baseball analytics, you're probably using stuff that's already been given to you, whether it's WAR, whether it's some of these other statistics that either Bill James or some of his disciples have put out. I'm making my own stuff, a lot of this stuff. So like I have a spreadsheet for almost every single position. I have my own equations that are leading me to some of the things that I'm seeing. And the other big advantage I have, this goes back to your Shaun Wade thing. Most people that do NFL draft work, they're NFL people first and foremost, not college people. And so like they're following the NFL closer during the season, stuff like that. And a lot of these guys are able to catch up by just, grinding the film, quote unquote, in, January, February. Well, at that point, when they're getting their first exposure to these guys and they're watching these clips that are pulled out of the context from which they occurred, I've already got 3, 4, 5 years of exposure to these kids because for my job, I cover college football every single day until I'm covering the NFL draft, the other half of the year. So I follow these kids on Saturdays. I'm on the clock for 10, 11 hours from the very beginning, an hour before kickoffs, all the way through to the end. And I'm one of those sickos that, Tuesday, Wednesday Maction, Thursday MWC and the AAC. Like I'm watching all that stuff for the Friday night Big 12 game or the Big 10 game. I watch it all. It's just I was infected with the sickness pretty early, and I'm not going to look for the anecdote, I guess.
You mentioned the shift to analytics and how that has kind of come into the game of football. I think back to the late 90s, early 2000s when baseball was going through the home run chases, the battles, really taking the headlines away from all other sports at that time. Jordan was in the NBA. You had that there. Since that era, the NFL has exploded, and analytics along with it has been introduced, coinciding with same time as social media and everybody who can be an expert and everyone has a voice and they have a platform now. I would imagine that there's good and bad that comes with all of that. You have the analytics that comes into the sport that kind of changes the game. How do you balance when you do dive in and you talk about how you have spreadsheets for every player and position and all these things? How do you put that into layman's terms for people like me that may not be able to dive in quite as deeply? That has to be an art as well to kind of, okay, here's the numbers, here's the science behind it, the math behind it. How do I put this into words that people can understand and kind of get that point across?
So like for me, when I'm ranking these guys or like some of that different stuff, it's, you're thinking about it in more sort of in a more dynamic fashion than say I was when I was in like 7th grade and I, buy the magazines and then, I make my own mock drafts back then. But now, I can go into all these other different things because you're just trying to get the most data and the most clear data, sort of separate the signal from the noise and get clarity on what your opinion is of the player. And sure, I might know more about schemes and scheme fit in the NFL, and I might know more about, different ways to look into the advanced numbers to try to, ascertain some things. But like that's one process. And then the other process, as far as like how you convey it to the audience, it's a different sort of a thing. But the better that you know the player from your own process, the easier it's going to be to convey to the audience or the viewer. So like, for instance, like John Madden was fabulous at this, like where he knew more about football than all three of us combined will, or has forgotten more about football than the three of us will ever know, sort of a thing. But like when he was talking on television, he was distilling that into a different sort, through a different sort of filter, and then conveying it to the audience in those sort of layman terms. And so it's a different skill set, but it's one that I'm certainly aware of, and you're actively trying to improve that, of how you can give a fully formed opinion of the player that as you see it in your eyes, but in a way that everyone's going to be able to understand. Because no one in any medium where they're speaking to an audience or they're writing for people is trying to exclude members of the audience. You want to make it so that everyone can be included in the analysis that you're giving, or you just aren't doing it right. So I mean, yeah, that's something I think about for sure.
Switching over to the beef of this, of why we wanted to get you on, let's talk about some NFL draft stuff. And first and foremost, we'll get into the Vikings probably a little bit more later, but now that we're through the combine, we're through the Senior Bowl, heard you on with Charge earlier talking about Malik Willis. Can you kind of give us your quarterback rankings? Because I'm fascinated by this class, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see where all these guys come off the board.
These are for sure rough drafts, but this is where I see it now. I mean, I can give you my top 20. We'll give you the top 15. So we'll just break the news right now. My top one for sure is Malik Willis. That one is not changing. Matt Corral's my number 2. That probably will not change. But that's, then 3 is Kenny Pickett for me. And that's more about buying cost certainty than it is shooting for ceiling, right? Like he's probably going to become like a, for Vikings fans, you think about it more like Teddy Bridgewater, but like Andy Dalton is sort of who I think about. And the bonanza come for him is Kirk Cousins, but he's not getting any better than that. And there's not maybe there's a 10% chance that he has Kirk Cousins' career. So that's sort of the phylum that you're in for him. That's why I don't see him as a top 10, 15 pick. Number 4, I have Carson Strong. So I have Carson Strong above some other people, the kid from Nevada. The reason that he gets nitpicked in his profile is it's not necessarily even because he comes from like the smaller college, the G5. It's because he had this knee injury and it was reported as being a long-term debilitating degenerative type thing. Well, what I've heard, it's not that. What I heard is it's not a long-term issue, and that this past season when he rushed back on the early end of his timeline to play, he had this knee brace on like the whole season up until the finale. His very last game was the first game he played in 2021 without it, but that thing was, again, to cut down the swelling. Well, the injury this past season, you have the swelling, you have this knee that's still recovering. It affected his mobility, which people have talked about. It also affected his ability to throw under pressure because it was harder for him to move around. And then he was also probably trying not to step into any of the bullets flying, maybe plant that leg where the knee could get taken out. And so like, those different. And then the other thing was because his base was compromised, especially on his plant leg, a lot of these a lot of these throws that you were seeing, they were all arm type throws. And so I see it a little bit differently than some other folks where they ding him huge for having a degenerative knee condition that I don't think is actually degenerative. And then they're not baking in the fact that he was compromised last year, where it compromised the mobility. It compromised some of these throws where it was all arm instead of his entire body. And so he's getting these scarlet letters from people on his profile where if the knee is not degenerative and it's not a long-term issue, not only must you take that off as a sort of negative thing, but it also explains away the 2 other major ones on his profile, which is the thing of throwing under pressure and then the mobility. So So for me, he is a cleaner prospect, I think, than some people are saying. He's a big pocket passer who's got a good arm. And he even mentioned this at the combine that now he's throwing the ball harder and with more velocity because that plant leg has gotten better. It's moving in on 100%, which isn't a surprise at all. When like if you go out and you try to throw without, let's say you're right-handed and you don't have your right leg, you have to stay stationary and throw it. You're not going to be able to throw as far as, if you're moving and then you can plant off the thing full. My fifth quarterback is Desmond Ridder. Some other people are a bit higher on him than me, but I think his ceiling is capped, despite the fact he can push the ball down the field, despite the fact that he's very athletic. He tested 95th percentile athleticism, but he's not he's a bit risk averse is the way that I would put it with him. Like Luke Fickell at Cincinnati clearly drilled into Desmond Ridder's head. Like, we want you to take the deep one-on-one shots to Alec Pierce specifically, a kid who's in this class, a wide receiver. But outside of that, they wanted him to take care of the ball. And so if it wasn't, for sure there, it was Desmond run or Desmond go down to, one of your safer options, short and outlet. Because of those reasons, I don't think his dual, the bigger arm and then the athleticism, that it will play up maybe like some people think to make him a first rounder. I compare him to Marcus Mariota. It's the same sort of play style. It's just people don't think about that as much because they came out of diametrically opposite college systems. Marcus Mariota was in the up-tempo Chip Kelly system, the guy that recruited him there. Kelly left after Mariota's first year, and then it was Helfrich the next 2 years, but it was the same system. Whereas Desmond Ridder, it was more of a pro-style thing. A methodical offense. They were one of the slowest in the nation in terms of running plays. And again, it was about, take calculated risks and then otherwise, take care of it, which I think is just embedded into Ridder. My sixth one is Sam Howell. I'm not a fan of Sam Howell. Coming into this past season, way more so, that's when he was getting all the Baker Mayfield comps. And some of those have still stuck around. But he ain't Baker Mayfield. They look the same. They have the same sort of physical profile. Athletic profile is probably fairly similar as well. But the big difference is Baker Mayfield at Oklahoma, he had a gumption about him. Not a cliche of like, he has swagger. But in terms of testing the defense at all levels, he wasn't afraid of taking those risks and putting the ball into tight windows and stuff like that, or making some of these sort of creative trick shot type throws in the intermediate area. Sam Howell, you saw an enormous depreciation of his game this past season when they lost 4 NFL skill guys. UNC did. Javonte Williams, Michael Carter at running back, and then Daz Newsome and Diami Brown on the outside. This year, he didn't have as much skill talent, even though their offensive line got a little bit better. UNC's, the skill talent was down. And because Howell, he needs to know that he might be even more risk averse than Desmond Ridder. He's not going to test the defense in those situations. The system that Phil Longo ran at UNC, it opened up these looks for him, whether it was downfield. If that's not there, you don't have the numbers there. There will be a number on the other side of the field. And so he's done sort of the half read sort of thing. And again, his game played way down when he lost all those skill guys. So a little bit lower on him. And then sort of, everyone has the same top, well, I guess 7, because you'd have the 6 Senior Bowl quarterbacks and then Corral. So my 7th one shouldn't be a surprise. It's Bailey Zappi. But then at 8, that's where it starts to get interesting again with everyone's rankings, because, it's pretty consensus that the top 7 guys in the class. But my 8, 9, 10 are Dustin Crum from Kent State, Cole Kelly from Southeast Louisiana, and then Jack Cohn from Notre Dame. So those are a couple of sleeper type guys that I would point the Vikings and the Vikings fans to if indeed they end up taking a quarterback like late on day 3 because the new administration doesn't like Kellen Mond.
Yeah, and that's actually interesting to me because and Matt Corral is a name that hasn't been thrown out as much, and I think that's probably because he's not performing at the combine, wasn't involved with the Senior Bowl, and I thought I was higher on him than I should be. So that's kind of a relief here. And you say that he is your 2. I think Malik Willis has rightfully earned that number 1 spot. And I agree with you on Ridder too. I've been seeing a lot of these analysts saying, hey, he's going to slide into the first round. And it's like, I turn on some of the film with him and it's like, I don't get it. Yes, the athleticism there. I actually have a buddy that's a diehard Oregon fan. So I was like, I could see it in a situation where Mariota is a bridge type quarterback. So we've had that conversation. It's crazy to me that you just said all of that as well. And then I like that you compared Kenny Pickett to like absolute highest ceiling as a Kirk Cousins, because a couple names that I've thrown around with Kenny Pickett, it's like, I'd rather draft a guy like Corral with a super high ceiling. In my opinion, the ceiling's higher. Whereas with a guy like Pickett, I could see him kind of turning into a Daniel Jones or Sam Darnold type player. Those are two names that I've thrown out. So it just kind of reassures me a little bit that I'm also not going crazy.
For sure. And I mean, Pickett, the two guys that you just tossed out there at the end, Pickett's tools are not as good as those guys. And this is even before, like, we talk about the fact that he has small hands. Like the hand thing is what's gotten all the sort of, juice or buzz or whatever. But Jim Nagy is also right about it, that he played outside at Pittsburgh for 5 years. But then Jim Nagy went a little bit further to sort of be like, it's not an issue. I don't agree on either end of the polarity. The thing to focus on there is his arm it's middling. It's not, it's not terrible, but it's going to be about average or so for an NFL starter. And the athleticism isn't really there either, right? Like, I mean, he's, he can move around a little bit, but he's not a dual threat or anything like that. Whereas Darnold, he hadn't worked out yet, but at least you could justify a higher pick because he was more athletic, a bigger kid, and could get the ball down the field. So like that's, when people are sort of poo-pooing the quarterback class, that's kind of why you only have the one guy who has the amazing tools that could turn into something truly special. And then everyone outside of that, you're sort of trying to, get your finger on exactly what could they become? What's the risk profile here? What are the odds that he hits that ceiling? And with Pickett, for me, it didn't make sense when, coming into the process that a lot of people had him as QB1, just because that ceiling is capped. And I knew that there was one other guy in this quarterback class. There is no ceiling on him. Malik Willis don't have a ceiling. It's an atrium. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to pull up the first question from our chat. It comes from Joshua, who joins us each and every week. He wants to know, hey, is it a requirement to have a hat and a beard to join this show? I'm going to take it one step further. I see a little tinge of red in every beard on this panel as well. So maybe that's a Minnesota thing. Maybe that is a requirement. We'll get to the real question here. This one comes from Jake Anderson, actually. He asked at the comments that there's great depth, at the edge and wide receiver. If the top two cornerbacks are off the board at 12, where do you see the Vikings going? And then, Thor, I'd love to elaborate a little bit. We're in Minnesota looking at Danielle Hunter watch and potentially traded in the next couple of days. Talk to us a little bit further about that edge rushing class that's coming in right now.
Yeah, as far as the beard thing, yes, it is. It is a requirement, and the hat thing. And I'm from north of the wall, like up in Brainerd, so I mean, like, we got to rep the beard and the hat. As far as the other question, I mean, yeah, this is a great question because let's just talk about the edge rusher position first, because it's the best position in this draft, and it happens to be one of the Vikings' highest needs, and it may even be the highest. But it's an interesting discussion with that because let's just say the Vikings' first pick. Where they're sitting there at the middle of the first round, there's going to be all these guys that are probably multiple ones that would be better at that position value in that slot than you would get in a typical year. So between, Jermaine Johnson, Trayvon Walker, if he falls, it's looking like he won't fall, but one of these guys is going to fall lower than people think because there's so many edge rushers. Karlaftis. It doesn't look like David Ajabo. I mean, there's been some news, breaking news out there about David Ajabo, crumbled during a non-contact drill today. So we're going to have to see what is going on there. If he tore an Achilles, he tore an ACL, he is not going to be in this discussion anymore. It's going to be, later in the first round. But if that's a scare and it wasn't a real thing, he would be in consideration here as well. But then, so you're going to have a couple of these guys and you have to decide what you think their value is in a vacuum, and then sort of extrapolate, when we're there round 2, round 3, what edges are going to be available. And the cool thing about this edge class is it's not only stacked at the top, it's also has tremendous depth, which is why it's the best position, in this class. So in the second round, you're going to be able to get an edge that's better than the typical slot that you're sitting in, a more valuable player in a typical year. Same thing with the third round. So you're going to get a value either way picking in the first 2 days at that position. It's just, again, it goes back to the 3-dimensional chess thing that Kwesi's going to have to do in his mind of like, okay, Jermaine Johnson just fell to us. That's awesome. Typical year, he's going to be a top 8 pick or so. But can I pull the trigger here when on day 2, I know that there's going to be the better edges as well, especially, for instance, they have the cornerback issue and then safety as well, the full secondary. Cornerback's not as stacked of a position in this class, especially there in the first round. So, like, you can do the 3-dimensional chess thing of do we reach, public perception, reach just a bit for a cornerback, in the first round, for instance, because we know that the talent there is going to drop off a shelf even more. For instance, like after a Trent McDuffie, or someone like that in the cornerback class, and then it's going to drop off. So when we pick in the second round, it's going to be the opposite sort of thing. You just have to sort of gauge that when you're making these decisions, but one is going to flower off to the other one. None of these decisions are made in a vacuum. So there's going to be a lot of that thinking going on.
Yeah, and I'm assuming the guy that asked that question, he's implying that the top two corners. Wanted to get your feedback on the corner because also I think it's pretty clear that the Vikings' biggest needs, it's pretty much on the defensive side of the ball. I think you can make the argument for wide receiver and interior offensive line as well. But the cornerback position, I'm assuming the top two that he's talking about, I want to bring this up because I heard you on with Charge today, and I think you might not really be in favor of the Vikings going with the Derek Stingley at 12. I think that's probably the one that he's implying. And then I don't think that Sauce Gardner is going to fall to the top 10 anymore. I think he's kind of solidified his spot within the top 10. And then talk to me a little bit more as well about Trent McDuffie, because when I turn on the film and watch him, it's very, very easy to fall in love with him. But then at the combine, the arm length kind of pumped the brakes, I think, a little bit with his draft stock rising. Can you talk about a little bit about how that might impact him come April?
Yeah, so starting with the top two guys, Gardner's the guy that you gotta love. Coming into the out of the season, people had Stingley as CB1, but that was sort of I think we were talking about this before. Like Stingley was one of the guys I came out in like early January and was like, Derek Stingley's not going in the top 15. And I mean, I'll stand with that until the draft, and I'll apologize if I'm wrong. But like at the time, that was when everyone was mocking him number 4 to the Jets. But there's issues there, and I would again I bang the table and advocate the fight. Do not touch that kid, because there's a couple different things going on. First of all, it's a totally unique sort of draft profile where he only had one good season out of 3. That happened to be his true freshman season. Was terrible as a sophomore, injured as a junior, and now he has the foot issue, whatever that's called. I'm blanking on the name of the foot condition. Liz Frank. That's what I was looking for. Thank you. He has the Liz Frank injury too, which is like, the kid was only good for 1 year. And a lot of the stuff you're thinking like, oh, it's, his athletic profile will help him get back there. And now he's got a Liz Frank injury. I want absolutely no part of Derek Stingley. He's only been a good football player above the high school level, 2019 pre-injury. So I don't want any part of him. Sauce Gardner is a top 10 cornerback. If he falls to the Vikings, you sprint that card in. I don't think it's going to happen, but sometimes things can happen and stuff like that. If it does, you sprint the card in. Outside of that, for me, McDuffie's the only guy I'm considering, and of course that includes Stingley being on the board with him as well. I don't know where the Vikings see McDuffie right now, but in terms of college football, the last 3 years, he basically been the most dominant one of this group. Him and Sauce essentially. And your point's well, there are things about his, build, specifically the lack of length that can concern you, but he shut down everyone he faced. Every single person. People didn't see it as much because of where he was playing, especially last couple of years. Washington was down, but he was just a total shutdown cornerback. His stats, when you look at the stats of the receivers going up against, more sparkling than any other player in this class. The athletic profile is there too. So as long as you're not as concerned about the length thing, and you can explain it away with his ball skills and stuff like that, he'd be the other guy that I would look at.
We talk about the quarterback class. We talk about what that looks like. We talk about the wide receivers and the edge and some of the positions that have depth. But when you look at this draft overall and you kind of say, okay, this is the depth point. This is where you can get a guy. If you take him before the 3rd round, you can get somebody who can come in and be an impact player right away. From a fan base we don't know what Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah is going to do and how he's going to approach the draft. But from a fan base that's so used to Rick Spielman trading back to get extra 6th, 7th round picks, Put a line somewhere in that draft and tell me where can you get guys that can come in and potentially have an impact right away. If they were to move around, if they were to move up, maybe, God forbid, the Vikings trade up in the draft, where could we be confident that they're going to get somebody who could come in and at least compete to be in that roster right away?
Yeah, well, this certainly the first 3 picks, you got to get immediate starters out of those, in my opinion, because of where the Vikings are right now, right? Like so much of that cap space went to Cousins, and they had a choice, what road they wanted to go down. That was the big, of course, when we're coming in, that was the big question. You keep Cousins, you're going to move on from Cousins, but now you decide to keep him. Now you have, this certain delineation of your cap. This big percentage is gone, and then some of these hopes and dreams that we had in free agency of like. It was a pretty good interior offensive line free agent class. So some people were hoping we could sign an immediate starter there, but all these guys are getting way more money, Scherf with Jacksonville and some of these other things. So the Vikings are still going to go into the draft with these holes, and they got more than 3 of them where they need a new starter there. And so it is imperative that they hit the first 3. And then I think they got, they're sitting 46 is the second rounder, 77 is the third rounder. And then they have 5 picks on day 3. I'm not sure about, the idea of trading up just because of the holes that you have: cornerback, edge, safety. You mentioned the interior offensive line. For sure, one guard. They got to start talking about when it's time to replace Garrett Bradbury too. But we can kick the can on that little one and call that like a secondary or tertiary need. But you absolutely need a new starting guard coming out of this offseason. And then linebacker, defensive tackle. And then I think you can make an argument too for wide receiver and tight end on a lesser level. And so because of that, you got to be sitting with 8 picks or so, because you don't have the cap flexibility to go out and sign guys that will plug in immediately. So that would be the only thing that I would sort of, how do I put this? I would have thought a trade up was in play had they traded Kirk Cousins, right? Like, there was the thing about Carolina had called on Cousins. There's a couple other teams interested. If you've gotten, let's say, Carolina's first round pick, and now you're sitting at 7 and 12 or whatever that is. And let's say you get an extra day 2 pick, maybe you get some picks next year. Now you have more flexibility where you could do more things. But I think they sort of locked themselves in to the lack of sort of roster flexibility and fluidity that we complained about with the previous administration. It doesn't mean that they can't build a better team, but it increases the importance that Kwesi at least nails the first 3 picks in this draft to get guys immediately in that can start and not embarrass themselves.
With you being so plugged into the NFL draft, can you talk to us a little bit about the situation? What in the heck is going on with Kayvon Thibodeaux? Because I hear reports coming out saying he might fall out of the top 10. And like when I would watch him, like I said, my buddy's an Oregon fan, so I'd watch plenty of Oregon football games. And when he was healthy, he's a day 1 difference maker. So I never saw him sliding outside of the top 10. Can you kind of talk about why that is and where you would see him getting drafted in this class?
Yeah, I've talked about this exact topic with numerous people in my industry. No one can completely figure out where these rumors about, Kayvon Thibodeaux's personality are. I can tell you the people around him like him a lot. And they depict it differently, that he's a very dynamic young man, that he's very clearly intelligent. Like he had a captivating segment at the combine, his podium time there. But like, some people will, the way it's being sort of depicted in some areas of the media is like, I've been hearing that, Kayvon Thibodeaux is not as focused on football as he should be. And he has these other interests, and he's concerned about things that he shouldn't be concerned about. And this sort of a thing. But again, like, I haven't gotten that from someone who's right next to the source. Like, no one said that. It's all this sort of telephone game. And the people that I've talked to that have been around him really like the kid. So it's a tough one. Like Josh Rosen had some of these similar ones. So you can't, like, when you hear criticism like this, you can't just be like, it's not true. I'm whatever. But because of some of the times when it's come up, when it did manifest in the NFL, you have to at least look into it. But there's ones where there's more examples of when these rumors come up when they didn't mean, the S word, like for instance, last year, Micah Parsons, he was a malcontent and he was a problem child and all this sort of stuff. Well, it turns out that's not his personality at all. And you can go further with that, et cetera. For me, I've never, outside of interviewing Thibodeaux in these settings, I've never spent, a day with him to try to figure out the way that he clicks. So, you sort of have to take with what, with what, some of these other people are. But with the Vikings, I'm talking about for my job, the Vikings, fortunately, they have, for instance, with a guy like Thibodeaux, they can get access to him, whether they met him at the combine, whatever, they can talk with him at his pro day, all this sort of stuff. They'll get a better idea of that. But I think some of this is BS, just because of the way that he talks and how intelligent he is. I think that there's some sects of the scouting community that do not want you to talk about things outside of football, do not want to project that you have things going on outside of football. But it's not just the ones that talk about it that do. Everyone has interests outside of football. So I think that stuff is overblown. And, if Thibodeaux is going to fall a little bit lower than we had initially thought, because he was, projected number 1 overall pick, sort of like, in like November or whatever, he's going to fall a little bit lower than that. But man, I'd said before, I wouldn't trade up if I was the Vikings. This might be the exception. If Thibodeaux falls to like 9 or 10, you got to think about, making the call. Could we toss you a day 3 pick and maybe round 2 or 3 next year and sort of move up for Thibodeaux because, let's say if Thibodeaux falls that far, it means for sure that Trayvon Walker has gone higher, and it probably means that Jermaine Johnson has gone higher as well. So you wouldn't have as many other, options. Then if Thibodeaux goes off the board before you too, maybe it's this thing where the edge rush started early. And so the Vikings in that scenario, I would call and see if I could hop up a couple. We don't know where Thibodeaux is going to go right now, though. It is totally fluid. He could go anywhere from like 2 all the way down to like, 9 or 10 or somewhere in there. And like I said, if he falls in the lower end of that, I'm calling about a trade up.
Hey, Thor, I got one more high-level question for you, and then we'll let Jack close it out with something more specific, because we've got basketball to watch today. We forget it's the NCAA tournament, and I know there's lots of games going on as well. One thing that I have been paying attention to from afar, and I know you have a more up-close viewpoint of it, there has been a trend in the recent years to move away from some of these workouts, some of these private workouts, some of the combine workouts, quarterbacks that don't throw, people only run 140, or they only do their private workout, up to the point now where we're talking about players who potentially in the near future could completely boycott the combine. Tell me your thoughts, first off, on what is valuable from something like the combine, what teams can get and why we should still do that, and then maybe how you balance watching game film and then watching some of these different intangibles from these individual workouts.
Yeah, I don't think the players will ever fully boycott the athletic workouts because it's going to help a lot of them. Or if they don't do it, it's going to introduce questions into their profile that they're not going to like, going to make them follow it. There are certain players that could always do it, and will certainly keep doing it, where the adding to they could only hurt themselves by submitting like, for instance, Evan Neal didn't test at the combine, and everyone already knows that he's an awesome athlete. So he probably just thought, man, if I get a bad start or whatever on the 40, and then that caused my stock to drop, that's stupid. So I ain't going to do this. But the importance about the athletic drills, it's not the only important thing is game film, or it's not, the only important thing is like the athletic composite. It's just, you go into this is the way I do it. You go into the class, you've seen all these kids for, like I said, 3 to 5 years, and you're going to have, there's very few guys that come in that you don't have any questions about their whatever, their evaluation or whatever. So like, I'll just give one specific example from this year. Treylon Burks, he comes in, he's projected, to go anywhere from like, 8 to 14 sort of a range coming into the combine. But his profile was like, he's raw in that at Arkansas, instead of just like being like, we're going to teach you to be a wide receiver 1, you're going to play on the outside, here's the route tree that you're going to run, we just want you to focus on these specific 7 or 8 sort of routes, and then how you break press coverage on the outside, etc. We're going to work on your footwork. Instead of that, it was sort of like more like the Laviska Shenault, at Colorado, or Rondale Moore at Purdue, where because he was by far the best offensive player on his team, they were just forcing him touches everywhere. So he'd play a little bit on the outside, play a little bit in the slot, play even some on the inline, play out of the backfield, and then you're just manufacturing ways to give him touches. A lot of these things were just like extended handoffs and stuff like that, as opposed, again, to having all these reps running, what you're going to be doing in the NFL, presumably playing outside receiver. And so because of that, there was some questions about the eval. But what you assumed, and the way that you were filling some of those questions in advance, is this guy's going to test awesome, because we've seen him running away from Alabama defensive backs, in the one game long touchdown. We've seen him, have better footwork than guys that were like 30 pounds less than him. And so, like, again, that's what you were assuming. Well, he comes in and tests way worse than that. He was more like an average sort of percentile historically. And because of that, instead of the baked in thing that we were assuming about the profile, that we could, sort of not explain away some of the rawness, but where you could project some of the things that that he's raw, and for him to jump up, you couldn't do that as cleanly with what his athletic profile had become. So naturally, you're going to fall from what the assumption was to what the reality is. That's where the athletic testing comes into play with some of these kids, or some of the kids that are off the radar that jump up. The other important thing about it is just figuring out, there's a certain threshold. If you test below that athletically, you're not going to make it in the NFL. You can look at thousands of people that have tested in the bottom 10 percentile, and basically none of them have succeeded. Pat Elflein's like, but I did for 1 year. But it's just, your odds of making it are just so much longer because of that. And so those are the things that the testing is important for. But there's some players where it's not important, either because the athleticism was not a thing for them, or it's not as big of a thing in their game, or you simply know what it is. For instance, I didn't need Lamar Jackson to run his 40. And I really don't need Malik Willis to do the athletic testing, but I want him to because he's going to test as one of the 3 most athletic quarterbacks in NFL history. So crossing the fingers for the pro day, but he doesn't actually need to do that for me to have that opinion. He's just going to confirm it if he does.
So final question from me. Say Kwesi comes in and does the unthinkable and drafts an edge in the first round. I think since the first time since I think it's Erasmus James. I believe that's the last time the Vikings did that. Who are some guys on day 2 at the cornerback position? And I think this will speak as to why I like Trent McDuffie so much. I love physical corners. And you don't even have to limit yourself at corner. Just in the secondary in general, I think Jalen Petre, if I'm saying his name correctly, he's a name that I think you're high on. I enjoy watching him on film. And another one that I'm a little bit higher on, I think the Draft Network has him ranked at like the 100th overall player. And I've read some stuff saying he might slide in a little bit higher. Cam Taylor-Britt, the cornerback out of Nebraska, a guy that I also like. Just love the physical style that those guys bring to the table. So who are some guys that you like that could improve the Vikings secondary on day 2?
Yeah, and there's even a chance that the Vikings would use both those on secondary, whether it be cornerback and safety. However, if you go the other way in the first round, I pronounce it Petrie, Jalen Petrie, as in Petri dish, but I actually don't know. But I'm just going to say Petrie. Love that kid. I like where your head's at with that. He's basically like 95% of the Honey Badger Tyrann Mathieu. He was used the exact same way at Baylor as Mathieu is used at LSU, and it's going to be the same thing in the NFL where he can play deep safety, and do that sort of stuff and trigger downhill when the pass comes, whatever, and help fill in with the run. Also a very, very good slot defender, in a nickel, coming up there, both in coverage. But again, at that point, you're playing closer to the line and you can do interesting stuff with him. One of the things he's very good at is rushing the passer, coming from some of these weird angles. And he always helps out against the run despite his size. He's a true sideline to sideline guy. Typically, when you're talking about that, you're talking about like a middle linebacker that starts in the middle of the field. Jalen Petrie, he'll start on the one side of the field as the nickel defender, and he will chase a running back down on the other side before he gets to the line of scrimmage. Do stupid stuff like that you don't see many other guys outside of Tyrann Mathieu do. And so, yes, he is undersized, but Petrie did prove that he was super athletic, during the pre-draft process, and he's just insanely active, and he's going to continue to be. In Mobile, he was the one defensive back that no one wanted to draw in the one-on-one drills because he was getting his hands on everything. So if I'm the Vikings and you're sitting there at 246 and you're not going to take a safety if their other pick unless Kyle Hamilton falls. If Petrie's available there, I'm thinking about that. A couple other names: Louis Sign from Georgia, same position at safety, very, very good college player, and then he came and tested even better than we thought in Indianapolis. Although I sort of got clued into this because I talked to his agent a couple of days before he had tested, and he's like Louis is going to jump way higher than people think, all this sort of, and it was true. Daxton Hill from Michigan is another guy more in the mold of Petrie in terms of he can play these multiple different positions. Some people are afraid of him, think about him as a tweener because you're sort of caught between corner and safety. But the good thing is his utility of these different skills, the different things he can do, whether it's playing deep in coverage, whether it's coming up and playing in the slot, he can do all that. And he's a speed merchant as well. So he's a guy that's going to go in the top 50. And if you're the Vikings, you're looking for safety help. He's a guy that you have to think about as well. And then if you go corner, whereas the first round, that one would only be specific scenario for me. We talked before, Sauce Gardner falls. The only other guy that one's the sprint in the card. Only other guy I'm personally considering the first round is McDuffie. And I'm not sure that I would do that with the other guys that are going to be there. Second, third round is probably more your power position, approaching the cornerback position there. One guy that a lot of people like is Roger McCreary from Auburn. He's another guy that sort of similar to, like, I'm not going to call him a poor man's McDuffie, but like a slightly discounted version of McDuffie where McCreary was awesome in college. And he tested okay. But he tested with the short arms, 28 and 7/8 inch arms. And he didn't measure in at 6 feet. It was 5'11 and a half. So, but feet, hips, man coverage, the press, like McCreary's arms aren't long, but he presses as well as anyone, in the cornerback class. Physicality and play strength are two of his, best traits, as well as form and stuff like that. It's just Does he have the length? And then his high end speed is capped. He ran a 4.5 in Indy. It was like 4.4 and 5 or something like that at his pro day. And then the other thing is hands with him is he deflected a ton of balls. He was number 4 in the nation, I think, last year in pass breakups. I think he was number 2 in the nation going back the last 4 years, if you combine them all in pass breakups. And yet he's getting his hands on all these balls. He only had 6 career interceptions. So there's a couple of things there, but certainly something that you could look at. And then a couple other guys, Tariq Woolen, who I talked about with Charge, he's the shoot for the moon type guy. It's like 6'3.5", runs in the 4.3s. His athletic composite score 99th percentile historically, going back to the mid 80s. So he's another guy you could look at. Kare Elam, a kid from Florida, a very long cornerback as well. He's another guy that's been falling a bit, or people haven't been talking about him as much. I'm not sure that he's going to fall all the way back to where you're sitting in round 2. But if he does, for me, he in the round 2, he's the sprint to the sprint up the card, because I think he would immediately come in and be the Vikings' best cornerback. So another name to look at.
Dude, this conversation has been great. We're going to let you go because I feel like we could probably talk all day if we didn't put a limit on it.
I can do that next time.
There we go. Yeah, and I hope that there will be a next time. This has been great. Thor Nystrom. You can follow him on Twitter at Thor, THORKU. Is that a Kansas nod there, I'm guessing?
It absolutely is. I don't know if you guys can see that, but
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, they played a good game yesterday. We're going to go watch some basketball and then dive into the NFL draft and free agency and continue this week as well. So, Thor, I really appreciate it, man. Thank you so much. Appreciate you all watching and the live stream and listening to the State of Purple podcast. You can find old episodes on iHeartRadio, iTunes, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Until next week, he's Jack Day. That's Thor Nystrom in the middle. I'm Aj Mansour. This is the State of Purple podcast.
10 seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Diggs. Stay up.